Hello and welcome along. In my last video, I finally finished the series on the legions before they met their Primarchs. And so what I thought I'd do now is a new series where I look at the lives of the Primarchs before they met their legions. So this is largely what they did on their planets that they landed on as children, what influence those lives they lived before being found by the Emperor had on them as adults. Now, of course, many of them had quite famously bad lives as children, and this may or may not have led into them being somewhat deranged as adults. Conrad Kurz stands out, Angron, of course, but what I'd like to do in each of those videos is look at a bit more of the details of what really happened to them and what options they had, what path they could have taken, etc. Did they have to turn out the way they did? So what I thought I'd do today to lead up to that video series is look at the Primarchs as a whole, and specifically look at the influence that their childhood mentors had on them, both positive or negative, and try and rank who had the best chances and the worst chances based on their childhood mentors. Now, not all of the Primarchs got this. Many of them actually essentially raised themselves or raised by groups of people. But the ones that did, they certainly had a profound influence on them, both positive and negative. Now, I'm probably going to call this video something like Who Had the Best Father or something like that. But they aren't all really father figures, but they broadly fall into that role of a mentor. So let's take a look. So when we look at who had a positive mentor, someone that had an important positive impact on their life, I think that Vulkan is a good choice. Now, he was raised by a blacksmith on Nocturne who was called Nobel and was a good all-round person. He really helped Vulkan develop into probably the most ethical of all the Primarchs, the most compassionate, the one closest to humans, the one that was probably the most rounded as a person. And although part of that is simply the way Vulkan was created by the Emperor, with his particular combination of genes, a big part of that also has to go to his upbringing on Nocturne by both the people in the community that he lived in and particularly his sort of surrogate father, Nobel. But certainly Vulkan had a deep love for him and respected him greatly and wanted to be like him, essentially. He wanted to be that kind of person. That helped Vulkan, this infant Primarch who has all of this incredible power but doesn't really understand what it is or where he's come from. It helped him to have a focus of, well, this is how you be a good person, or this is the kind of person that you should be. And the impression that Nobel made on Vulkan lasted with him throughout his life. Even when Vulkan's life took a certain direction into very dark places, he always had that sort of anchor point of his upbringing by Nobel, his experiences he had with him as a child that he could fall back on, that would bring him back to the right path and help him stop slipping into madness. For example, of course, he was tortured to death many, many times over and over by Conrad Kurz, which did break him, temporarily turned him insane. He always had this anchor point to come back to. And so when he was eventually revived and reborn, he still was able to find himself again. And I think that a lot of that comes back to that upbringing he had from Nobel. So that's why I'm going to put Nobel in the top 3. So next, for positive influence, this may be slightly left of field. This is Luther and the Lion. So famously, the Luther and the Lion did fall out, and Luther became one of the great heretics, great traitors of the imperial history. But when the Lion needed him as a child, Luther was an incredible father figure stroke mentor to him. He saved him from being killed essentially as a child when he was first found. He trained him as a knight. He took him into the order. He really gave the Lion all of the advantages within the society of Caliban that you could want for. He was mentored by the most powerful man within the most powerful group on the planet. He was given this incredible education. He was turned into the Lion that we would come to know by his time with Luther. If he hadn't been mentored by Luther, he could have been a very, very different person. And Luther was the greatest man on Caliban before the Lion arrived. And he gave everything he had to turning the Lion into the greatest man on Caliban, despite the fact that that meant he was eclipsed. Now, of course, this meant that eventually, partly because of the way the Lion behaved, but this did lead to a certain degree of resentment of what Luther could have had, what he could have been, had the line not been there in his way, because essentially, no matter how great a man you are, you can't be better than a Primarch. The gifts that a Primarch has are always going to exceed that of a mortal man. So that meant that resentment was there in the background, and it could be worked on by Chaos. I've done a separate video on Luther himself. Go and watch that. I think gives you a much deeper insight into Luther and why he eventually betrayed the Lion. But if we focus on the influence he had on the Lion as a child, the Lion really did do well out of that arrangement. And so Luther has to be right up there as one of the best mentors stroke father figures. I mean, Luther really saw the Lion as more as like a younger brother in many ways. That showed in their relationship. It was a bit more equal than some of the other relationships. So the Lion didn't really grow up seeing Luther as his father, and so Luther had less of a control over him. He saw him more as this older brother who just taught him all of these great things. But then there's a point, obviously, in every sibling relationship where the younger brother becomes an adult, and then they potentially feel like they are now better than their older brother. And I think that's more like what Luther and the Lion had in their relationship. So there you go. So Luther is number 2. So number 1 for positive influences is Guilliman and Connor Guilliman. He actually got his surname from his mentor. Now, his father was a warrior king, a great leader, a wise man, someone who gave him a first-class education, taught him how to be a general and a leader of people. Essentially, Guilliman was born with the silver spoon in his mouth, and he was given everything you could need to succeed, to be the best Primarch he could be. So Connor has to be number 1. He also conveniently dies just in time to allow Guilliman to take over without having to overthrow his father. So he's clean of that as well. So Guilliman's rise through childhood to the point of being an adult and then becoming king of his world, it was all set up for him to be in the perfect position. And so it's not really any surprise that he then went on to create, this great empire of his own that really eclipsed any of the other Primarchs in terms of territory controlled. And so most of that really comes back to Connor. If Guilliman had ended up on, Nuceria, like Angron, and been raised in the slave gladiator pits, he would not have been the leader of a spacefaring empire when the Emperor found him. He would have been a jabbering lunatic, just like Angron. And if Angron had been raised by Connor, he may well have turned out to be one of the most capable of the Primarchs, one of the most well-balanced. And now, he wouldn't have been exactly like Guilliman, of course, because they do have underlying genetic qualities that the Emperor put into them when he created them, based on the purpose he had for them. So you could argue that Guilliman was clearly created to be a great strategist, and him landing on Macragge and having been mentored by Connor matched up perfectly, so he became the person the Emperor wanted him to be. And if one of the other Primarchs had ended up on Macragge, their underlying genetics may have led them to be not quite the right person to be mentored by Connor, but you can certainly say they would have had a much better life. I mean, you can imagine someone like Perturabo, for example, had he been mentored by Connor, he may well have ended up as being at least as successful as Guilliman, and perhaps even more so, because it does seem like Perturabo, his underlying genetics are superior to Guilliman. Now, okay, that's a bold statement, but I do feel that I do think that's true. And really, Perturabo was held back by his unfortunate upbringing, which we'll come to shortly. So there you go. So Guilliman, I think, has to go down as having the number 1 best childhood mentor. So the worst childhood mentors for the Primarchs. Let's start off with number 3, Perturabo. Now, his mentor, stroke father figure, was, I believe, pronounced Damikos or Damkos. I'm going to go with Damikos. It's the planet of Olympia, and I think so. It's a Greek influence culture, so you would probably pronounce that Damikos. I'm going with that. He wasn't obviously a terrible mentor in that he did give Perturabo position of power and opportunity. He taught him things. He taught him valuable skills in being a general and this kind of thing. But he did it in a way that was very cold, very lacking in any affection, which led to Perturabo being very bitter And now you could argue that was something within his own genetics, that he was always going to be like that. But it does seem like that he did have the potential to be as well balanced as any of the other Primarchs. And it was really that terrible upbringing that he got, where he was treated essentially as a useful tool with no actual bond between him and his mentor, stroke father. And so he really struggled to build those bonds with the other Primarchs or with the Emperor when he was an adult. Now, of course, the Emperor himself doesn't win any prizes for father figures, and so the Emperor essentially carried on treating him in exactly the same way. But whereas some of the other Primarchs had this childhood upbringing that gave them that kind of human connection, that bonding that they needed, Perturabo never got that. So he just went from one unloving father who treated him like a tool to another, and just felt that must be the way things are. And he was always lacking that human side that some of the other Primarchs got. And so I think it's fair to say it wasn't best upbringings he could have had. So I put him in as third. Now, as I mentioned earlier, if you put him in Guilliman's position, you swap their fathers, I think it's fair to say that Perturabo could have had at least the same kind of life and success that Guilliman had, and potentially more, and probably would have been one of the loyalists in the heresy. Really, he turned to Horus because Horus was one of the very few people that showed him any kind of affection. So any kind of brotherly bond, fatherly role, it was Horus. He did have a relatively close relationship with Magnus, particularly in these earlier days, but the other brothers really didn't have any connection to him at all. And so Horus was the one that he kind of looked to as someone he could admire. So he was kind of primed for that by this upbringing he had, where he was essentially treated as an object and didn't have any kind of camaraderie or any bond with the people around him. So if he had been brought up under Guilliman's circumstances, he would have been protected from that. He wouldn't have had this deep longing for someone to give him some respect, to just treat him a little bit, to treat him more than just an object and a tool, a weapon. Which, of course, Horus, you could argue Horus was doing that, but Horus was doing it in a way that makes it look like he's not doing that. And so that depends on how you see Horus and how his personality changes over time, etc. But certainly by the time of the heresy, he is just treating him as a tool, a useful tool to win the heresy, but he does it in a way that allows his followers to think that he really cares about them and really values them. But I think it's fair to say, if you look at Horus, in the earlier years of his life, he did genuinely treat people well because he wanted to treat them well. He wasn't just manipulating them. Just turned out that it did give him a lot of opportunities when the heresy came, because of all the relationships he developed before the heresy. Anyway, so there we go. So it's Perturabo number 3. Number 2, Lorgar. Lorgar was mentored by Corferon, and Corferon really did kind of take on a fatherly role, in some ways more like a creepy uncle role. He was a very strange man and very much a religious zealot. He was part of the old order of the planet that Lorgar would eventually come to rule, Colchis, and he was deeply interwoven into that culture's faith in the chaos powers. They didn't really have a concept of chaos as such, but they knew that there were higher powers, that those powers were both useful and very demanding. So they had this old religion, as they called it. They had developed this culture of worshipping these powers, these gods, but they didn't entirely understand what they were. They weren't revealed to them as fully as chaos would be after the heresy or during the heresy. But Corferon was deeply embedded in this culture, and so although he took on Lorgar as his sort of surrogate child, and he eventually gave up in public the ways of the old religion, because Lorgar obviously was reunited with the Emperor, allowed the Imperium to take over the planet, rapidly started to focus his attention on the Emperor and really develop his Emperor worship idea. Corferon was kind of allowed that to happen. He didn't object to it publicly, but in the background, he always had these beliefs in the chaos powers, and he slowly corrupted Lorgar over time with those beliefs, particularly, of course, when the Emperor rejected Lorgar. Once that had happened, Corferon and Erebus, of course, were ready to pounce on Lorgar. And so being mentored by someone who was already deeply corrupted and always would be, was obviously going to put Lorgar in a terrible position. So the thing about Corferon is, not only was he not following the imperial truth, and worshipping gods, some spiritual other world, which that was in the background of many of the worlds that the Imperium took over. He was specifically worshipping the Ruinous Powers, the Chaos Gods, and already was just a deeply corrupted man. He wasn't a good person corrupted by chaos. He was a bad person who embraced chaos, but because it fitted his goals, his ideals, his beliefs, the way things should be, which was essentially putting himself first. So he was always going to be corrupt, and even if the Chaos Gods didn't exist, Corferon was never going to be a good father figure for Lorgar. And really, he took Lorgar on because Lorgar was obviously a very powerful being. He wanted to mold that powerful being as much as he could to his benefit. And of course, on top of this, the fact that he had these extreme religious views and this belief in the old gods, etc., meant that it fed into Lorgar's need for worship, need for something above him, some higher power that he could turn to for answers, etc. And so Corferon could keep those ideas alive and feed them with Lorgar as a young Primarch, so that it made it even more likely that Lorgar would become obsessed with the Emperor and try and worship him, which made it even more likely that he would eventually be rejected by the Emperor and would be ready for the traitors and the Chaos Gods to take advantage of him. So certainly if Lorgar had a better mentor, someone like Conor Guilliman, it would have taught him the valuable skills of being a rational leader, a general, a tactician. Yes, he would never be the tactician that Guilliman would be, but he would have been a far more balanced person and someone able to resist the temptations of chaos potentially. So that is number 2, Corferon. So number 1 is the Overlord. Now this was the alien, the Xeno, who was Mortarion's father, for want of a better word. He didn't do much in the way of mentoring. I mean, didn't help Mortarion much at all. Basically, he tortured him, poisoned him, generally abused him for his entire childhood. But it did turn Mortarion into an incredibly hard person to kill, but also someone who was obsessed with death and suffering, and of course would eventually lead him down the route to chaos corruption. It also meant that he was always a very difficult person. Even after the Emperor found him, he had no real positive impact on him. He was just a general bastard and someone that you just didn't want to be around. No one wanted to be around him. Mortarion didn't really want to be around anyone either. He didn't seem to have any need for friendship, but at the same time, no one wanted to be with him or build any relationship with him. None of his brothers were close to him. It was equal opportunist with his hatred. He disliked the Emperor. He distrusted the Emperor. He kind of saw the Emperor as basically another overlord, someone who would just dominate and abuse him. And he saw his brothers as kind of barriers to his own ideas and success. Even Horus, although most of the other Primarchs kind of saw Horus as the exception, as a brother that they could look up to. I mean, the Primarchs that didn't like looking up to their other brothers, so people like Angron, Perturabo, even Kurz kind of could accept Horus as being that one exception that they could kind of see as someone who genuinely saw the best part of them. And Mortarion didn't really have that. It was just convenient that he kind of felt inevitably that the Imperium would fail and that he would take part in that. And so he joined Horus simply because it was a way of making people suffer. And that was it, really. He certainly, I think it's fair to say that he probably had the worst possible start of any Primarch based on supposed father figure stroke mentor in the Overlord. Now, you could argue that there were other Primarchs like Kurz and Angron who had worse childhood because they had nobody, and they were also essentially spent their lives being abused until the Emperor found them. Well, I suppose in Kurz's case, he did most of the abusing, didn't he? But he had a terrible upbringing, and obviously Angron was literally a child gladiator. And then, I mean, I suppose you couldn't read much worse than Angron's upbringing. But with Mortarion, he had this figure in his life who should have been preparing him for the future, should have been mentoring, making him better, helping him become the best Primarch he could be, or the best person he could be, but he didn't. He just made him into the deeply bitter, deranged arsehole that is Mortarion. So there you go, he's the worst. So there you go, that's my top 3 best and worst father figures stroke mentors for the Primarchs. just an honourable mention to the worst father of them all in the 40k universe, the Emperor himself. Of course, he is largely responsible for much of the good and the bad of the Primarchs. And of course, the one Primarch got special attention from him more than any other, and was effectively brought up by the Emperor, and that was Horus. So Horus was found so early that he was still a child, probably. I mean, the stories are mixed, but essentially that seems to be the most likely story for Horus, that he was found very young, and that the Emperor essentially brought him up. So the Emperor was his childhood mentor, father figure, unlike the other Primarchs who had to find out that the Emperor was their real father much later. And so Horus had, in many ways, the best and worst, because as he had this massive advantage being found first, the Emperor could mold him exactly how he wanted him to be. He could teach him all of these things that he knew really early and give him the one-on-one undivided attention for all of this time. Now, of course, Horus eventually would fall to chaos, and part of this has to go down to the way the Emperor treated him. I mean, we don't exactly know what the Emperor did to make Horus the way he was, but when he had all of this time with him, I think it's hard to say that the Emperor doesn't have any responsibility for what Horus turned out to be. And treating his sons so much like tools and weapons, and not really having any personal bonds with them, trying to keep them all at a distance, not develop any feelings for them, does seem to have had a detrimental effect on most of them. And particularly with Horus, his need to please the Emperor, to show how good he is, to show he was the best all the time, may have been that thing that led to him falling to chaos. Because he couldn't be the best all the time. There was always going to be things that he did wrong, or things that didn't quite work out quite right. So he always had this inner self-doubt that he wasn't quite good enough for the Emperor. And the Emperor does seem to be very good at putting that doubt into people and making them feel like they're not quite good enough. And ultimately, that little quirk within Horus is what caused him to fall to chaos. If that's the Emperor's fault, then the whole heresy is the Emperor's fault. So that has to make him the worst. Anyway, what do you think? So tell me what you think. Is there anyone worse that I've missed out? Let me know what you think. Give me your best and worst. Give me your judgment on the Emperor as a father. Look out for my new series, which will cover the early years of each of the Primarchs. And of course, like, subscribe and share. And I will see you next time.